And welcome to World Maritime Day. Can I ask all the friends to come in? There's seats at the front here. Please come forward. Jamie. Welcome to World Maritime Day. Before we start, I'd like to introduce Kevin Torrey to do the Welcome to Country.
Thanks, comrades. I'd like to welcome everybody here today on World Maritime Day. Very important day in the lives of seafarers worldwide. I'd also like to acknowledge we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Greater Eora Nation and pay my respects to the elders past and present and emerging. Today, I remember here about 20 years ago I was asked to lay a wreath here on behalf of many of the coloured seamen, Lascars I think they called them, that died during the Second World War, that didn't get a great deal of recognition for the roles they played in the Merchant Navy. And many of those seamen who were sank on boats within our region were treated very badly by the colonial Australian government at the time. But I don't know that it's so much different today when you've seen what happened to that young Sri Lankan couple there. All right, anyway, welcome today and thanks very much, comrades.
Thanks, Kevin. It was just over 50 years ago, on a Saturday, the 23rd of August 1969, when the MV Noongar left Newcastle en route for Townsville, carrying a cargo of 1,500 tonne of steel. Steaming past Smoky Cape, the Noongar encountered mountainous seas as she was flanked by a cyclonic depression. Just 2 days later, the ship's master radioed seeking urgent help. That was at 3:55 a.m. The Noongar had developed a list which could not be corrected. At 4:37 a.m, the master signalled again that the crew of 26 were abandoning ship. The waves made launching of the two lifeboats near impossible. After harrowing tales, 3 members who hung onto a plank were picked up by the freighter Moringa. A 4th crew member who was also on the plank was rescued, but had already passed away. 2 further survivors had been rescued by the Japanese tanker Kayumaru, some 10 miles off Crescent Head. One of the largest search and rescue efforts at the time was undertaken. 5 life jackets were found during that rescue attempt, and despite obvious signs that they had been used, the life jackets were empty. 4 days later, after the Noongar sank, the air and sea search was discontinued. The bodies of the remaining 20 crew members were lost to the sea. And in the 50th year since her sinking, we continue to recognise the lives of those crew members and their contribution to the industry. We recognise the lives and contributions of all seafarers and waterside workers who have been lost in times of peace. And we recognise their contributions for those who have been lost in times of war. And we celebrate them on this World Maritime Day. Generations of maritime workers who are pivotal towards the international society that we live in, through their labour being the backbone of international trade. We reflect the great sacrifices made by merchant seafarers who man those ships to the world of progressive society. For many seafarers, going to work meant going to war. World War II saw 1 in 8 seafarers die through the horrors of war. It was their service that kept the supply chains open in the fight against European fascism, in the fight against Japanese militarism. We also remember the 33 wharfies killed during the 1964 bombing raids in Darwin. There, waterside workers kept fronting the docks, even as workers were killed by the raids on the job. And today, on behalf of Paul McAleer, Paul Keating, Nathan Donato and myself, Paul Garrett of the Sydney Branch Executive of the Maritime Union of Australia, we thank all comrades and friends for joining with us at today's celebration. In particular, it's appropriate for us to recognise some special guests. From the Australian National Maritime Museum, its curator, Dr. Stephen Gapps. Stephen, again as we congregate at these Vernon anchors, we thank you and the museum for their use of this magnificent facility and the ongoing recognition that the Maritime Museum has towards maritime workers on this important day. I'd like to welcome Stephen to the microphone.
Thank you for that welcome and introduction. I'm here today on behalf of the Director of the Museum, Kevin Sumption, who can't be here. So as mentioned, I'm one of the curators here, and I'm I've got the pleasure of welcoming you on behalf of the Director and the Museum. In my role here over the last few years, I've been looking after our large collection of objects and material that deals with maritime trade unions and maritime workers, including the iconic Sydney Wharfies mural and the Seafarers Memorial anchors you see here today. Before we begin, I'd just also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and the nearby waters that we meet on today. So it's my great pleasure and an honour to welcome you here to the Australian National Maritime Museum for World Maritime Day. The museum is delighted we can host this event again this year. It's a busy time for the museum as we undertake several major work projects that, with luck, will be completed by this time next year. Today's always an important day on the museum's calendar as we commemorate and remember comrades, seafarers and maritime workers who have lost their lives in peacetime and at war. I'd like to reaffirm once again that the museum is committed to ensuring that the material heritage, the history and the personal stories of Australia's maritime workers are recorded, preserved and, most importantly, shared with the community at large. The history of our maritime industry is a significant theme in Australian history and it remains a key area of interest and research here at the museum. Over the next few years, the museum is undergoing some key transformations and in particular, the main narratives of the stories of Australian maritime history will be redeveloped. It's a central theme in our collecting and storytelling that both ancient and modern Australia is, was and continues to be shaped by its relationship with our oceans, our seas and our rivers. An important part of this relationship has been through industry and trade and the people who work in these areas. The famous Sydney Wharfies mural is undeniably one of the prized items in the museum's collection. And it's not only it's striking, but it has a rich set of stories to tell. You probably know the history of the mural itself, but thanks so much to the MUA for being able to save this canvas of maritime worker history. And I am really confident that one day we've got a section of it on display in the Tasman Light Gallery, but I hope one day, I'm sure one day we'll have the whole mural reinstated. In other areas of the museum's display, we honour and remember merchant sailors. We have a bronze sculpture in front of Wharf 7 to Windjammer sailors. I also note that we've had a temporary travelling exhibition called Container, the Box That Changed the World, that was shown here at the museum, was here last year. It's been since to Wollongong, to Albury and even to Narrabri. It explores the history and impact of containerisation, and it's been one of the most successful free outdoor exhibitions the museum has developed. It's been seen by tens of thousands of visitors. I also note that an exhibition I developed for the museum in 2014 called Black Armada, Australia's Support for Indonesian Independence, tells the story of the Australian, Indian, Chinese and other maritime workers' boycott of Dutch shipping in Australian ports during 1945 to 1949, that greatly assisted the Indonesian independence movement. This exhibition is now being redeveloped for display in Jakarta later this year. And one last thing that we're also doing, we have an outreach program of visiting speakers, and they have added a talk to their series on the Merchant Navy that focuses on the Iron Crown. So the National Maritime Museum continues to tell the stories and struggles of maritime workers and will do so with the new gallery redevelopments over the coming years. And just to finish up, on behalf of the museum, I thank you again for coming and marking this special day here at the museum with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Furthermore, we'd like to acknowledge some of our other friends here today, Captain Alan Tate, Captain Ken Ross, MUA Veterans President Fred Krauset, our own saint, Sister Mary, MUA Newcastle Deputy Secretary Dennis Outram and the delegation from Newcastle, thank you for coming down. MUA Southern New South Wales Secretary Michael Cross and the delegation from Port Kembla, thank you for coming as well. All the retired veterans, members and youths who have come today. Our Deputy National Secretary Will Tracy, our South Australian Secretary Jamie Newland, thank you for coming as well. Next guest I'd like to welcome to the microphone is a seafarer who's had the honour of representing workers not just here in Australia but around the world in his capacity both as MUA National Secretary and International Transport Workers Federation President, someone who needs no introduction, Paddy Crumlin.
Thanks, Paul, for that generous introduction. So that's very, what do you call that? It just brings out museum. I don't know what it means, but it's important to us. And it's just not about museum, it's about what we're doing now. See, firstly I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. Where's Kev? Still here, Kev? And the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. When you hear about Cockle Bay, you can imagine it pre-1788 or right up to 1820. It was Cockle Bay because of the oysters and the wonderful seafood. And when you think of that our beautiful Indigenous race that walked all the way from Darwin, that's a long walk. But they didn't take a shortcut. They ended up over in Tassie. I'm not sure how they got across the Bass Strait, but that's probably another story. But see, part of the recognition if you can't recognise your Indigenous people, their spirituality and their diversity, the great length of time of isolation, their ability to nurture and function over 60,000 years, it's almost impossible to build a modern society predicated upon the same values of recognition, of mutual respect, of, ownership of everybody, of transparency. And I think our failure, and that's one of the reasons we recognise the traditional owner of the land and the elders, past, present and emerging, because it's about leadership too. It's about a recognition of continuity, that if you stick to the guns, you get there. And by recognising our Indigenous people, we're also recognising some of the finer values of the human condition. And I would dare to extend that to the Australian condition and the Australian community. And part of the failures in the community now is that we don't recognise that. We can't find that voice of reconciliation. We're still a diverse and elitist group where there's more to divide us than brings us together. And it's a terrible thing for our Indigenous people to see that, having nurtured the land, having developed their special spirituality that we know more and more about, the great diversity of language, to see over the last 200 or 300 years how we've taken something and haven't delivered something better in the way of human values and how you do it. And there's nothing more demonstrative than that, than in the area of, seafaring and the whole issue around merchant shipping. It's part of the wealth creation, and it was essential in colonial times. It was essential in the First World War. We had a national line, the Commonwealth Steamship Line, that was dismantled. But by bipartisan belief, it was built up again because of the Second World War and the 1 in 8 seafarers that Paul referred to and that are mentioned on the anchors donated by the MUA and funded by BHP at that time. A little bit more on BHP in a second. And we've then been able to really produce something out of nothing out of something. When 1 in 8 Australian seafarers die, it's not a rhetorical thing or a sentimental thing any more than Anzac Day is a sentimental thing. It's a reminder about something given without wanting to take anything back. And when they found the Iron Crown, it's a tragic and sad reminder that that's a war grave where those seafarers were never recovered. And to find the shell of that ship, off the Victorian coast is a poignant reminder of what seafarers, from the captain to the deck boy, had given for their country. Was not to have the recognition, or not to put it in the context that what they were fighting for was an Australia that was inclusive and an Australia that would able to distribute opportunity, an aspirational Australia, an Australia that was prepared to fight and live for and die for. And, Paul mentioned the memorial. up a Smoky Cape the other day, where the union wants to donate some in the memory of those seafarers lost. Just as that was a ship that was lost in peace. Just a little ship, 1,300 deadweight, 24, 25 on the ship. Only 4 survived. The rest, the bodies were never found. And so when we were up there, it was the family and the community that were celebrating and reflecting on the meaning of the loss of those lives. It's something where Della Elliott and the other unions, Mick Fleming was involved in it, all 3 unions, AIMPI, because all 3 unions, well, there's 7 unions in those days, were all part of the nurturing of those families, widows and children, into another stage of their life. But to move on 50 years later and not have the footprint of what that meant, just a crew of Australian seafarers, all men that lost their life on an A&L ship, Australian National Line, owned by the government, under bipartisan. 50 years ago, it wasn't a Labor government, it was a Liberal government, it was a Conservative government that understood the importance of securing your coastal waters and the importance of protecting ourselves against international monopoly shipping interests that didn't have the Australian interests at heart. And when we think about those 2 ships and the lives lost, one lost at war, one lost in peace, it wasn't an historical fact, it's an existential fact. It's what the same qualities that we're looking for in our society today. An ability to redistribute wealth on a fair and identifiable basis. The ability for politicians to come together in a genuinely bipartisan way that provide jobs, provide industry, can agree the overall interests of the national interests and the sovereign interests, can differentiate on ways forward, but don't differentiate on what we stand for as a nation. And when we come here every year, as seafarers, and I see many chief engineers and engineers, officers, ratings, waterside workers, many who gave their life, and don't forget about Darwin and the bombing of Darwin, and Steve looks like a seaman actually. Is he taken off? I look like the bloke looking after things, and you look like the union official, mate. Unbelievable. But and give my best to Kevin too. While I'm on it, I mean, this was going to be a monument to colonialism and the Royal Navy. If it wasn't for us, and it wasn't for you, but it wasn't for all of you, and it wasn't for our merchant history, if it wasn't for Alan Oliver, and it wasn't for the 3 unions, and if it wasn't for BHP, that were essential to Australian industry over that 100 years, that it probably would have been that. And when you mention the Waterside Workers mural, some of it which is on display, and some of it, Jimmy Donovan's here, the president of the union, will always be the president of the union, even though in retirement. Got no idea how much blood, sweat and tears, where's Jim, that went into getting that over in one piece, Jim, because this was the home. You decided at the Sydney branch, the mighty Sydney branch, the Waterside Workers Federation, now the MUA, wanted to make sure that footprint of labour, that footprint of history, was going to be recognised in our history here in the museum, so that would also be a segue for what we had achieved as what we can achieve. So while we come here in a process of celebration, we come here in a process of recognition and memorial, we also come here that our message will reach out into a society that seems to be rudderless of real political leadership, into a society that has never relied on shipping more than it does today, into a society and into an economic community where our industry is failing and we're relying more and more on international trade to secure the wealth, to secure the community and social benefits. We come here proud seafarers, proud maritime workers, proud waterside workers, that we didn't just fight for our members. We didn't just look for a redistribution and a decent redistribution of the quality and importance and value of our labour. We came here and gave our lives in war and peace to build a better Australia, a survivable Australia, a society like all of those young students that want a future, not just a future where, you know, we have an environment to survive, but a future where decent jobs based on an ability to identify the importance of our economy and our national interest isn't set aside by political cynicism and elitism. That's our hope. And there's no better place than a museum. A museum is a mirror on the past. For yesterday's history, Steve, tomorrow's a mystery, and today's the gift that we've got in celebration of those lives given, those lives saved, all of those families from the Noongar that were secured by not secured by the company. A&L's gone now. Australian National Line is an FOC with Panamanian flag and has no contact whatsoever. And it was privatised in this country and is still servicing international interests. And it was set up by Black Jack McEwen in a bipartisan way so that we would secure against colonial manipulation or monopoly or against international ship own and economic monopoly, we would secure our sovereign rights. Now, it's extraordinarily important on that basis and for those families and for those lost lives that when we reflect on what's been given, we also reflect on our determination, our courage in the face of political adversity, our willingness to know that in real truth lies power, not just for a few, but for all Australians and by extension, all seafarers. Thanks very much. And again, on reflection, maybe we can all stand up just for a minute and reflect the wonderful contribution that these anchors represent. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, friends and comrades.